Pushkin at the Lyceum by Vina Pomnyashi, not far from Leningrad, in the city of Pushkin, which was formerly called Tsarskoselsky. There is a palace where the royal family usually spent the summer months. A simple and beautiful building is connected to the palace by a covered gallery. In it, on October 19, 1811, an educational institution for the children of the nobility, the Tsarskoselsky Lyceum, was opened. If you happen to visit this house, go up to the fourth floor and find room number 14. A boy named Alexander Pushkin lived and studied here for 6 years from 1811 to 1817. The Tsarskoye Park, decorated with a monument of military victories and marble sculptures, was a place for walks of Lyceum students. Alexander rushed along its alleys like a whirlwind, started a trend of games and pranks. But often, lagging behind his comrades, secluded in a remote corner of the park, he plunged into deep thought. People often noticed that he was standing alone in the corner of the hall, where in the evenings the students were dancing or fencing. With burning eyes, slightly conducting with his hand, he recites something in a low voice. Once, it was in the first year of Lyceum life, the professor of literature gave the students the task.
Describe, please, a rose in verses.
Among the Lyceum students, many were fond of poetry. Everyone rushed to write, but the poems did not work out at all. Alexander wrote something, blacked out, wrote again, and got up after a few minutes, and recited 2 quatrains that delighted everyone. Soon after him, the glory of the first Lyceum poet was finally strengthened. He often talked and argued about literature with his close friends Ivan Pushkin, the fat and good-natured Anton Delvig, the lanky and clumsy Wilhelm Kuchelbecker, who was simply called Kulya. Pushkin's and Pushkin's rooms were nearby. In the evenings, when everyone went to bed, they talked for a long time through a thin wall. Alexander shared his joys and sorrows with his friend, read him new poems. One day Alexander fell ill. Comrades came to him to the infirmary.
"And I wrote poetry,"
said Pushkin, and, taking out a piece of paper, he began to read a cheerful poem about Lyceum life, about his comrades. At the end there were very funny lines about Kuchelbecker, who they generally liked to make fun of. They all rolled with laughter. Kind Kuklia was touchy, but he liked what his comrade wrote so much that he rushed to hug Alexander.
Pushkin, dear. Well, please read again these marvelous verses.
Kuchelbecker and Delvig were talented poets themselves. Once, one warden, who was spying on Lyceum students, took away a piece of poetry from Delvig at a lesson. Alexander felt hurt for his friend. He jumped up and shouted indignantly,
"How dare you take our papers? So will you also take our letters from the boxes?"
There was a rumble among the Lyceum students, and the confused warden was forced to leave the classroom. And life took its course. Russia was in trouble. The French Emperor Napoleon invaded the country with a huge army. The Patriotic War of 1812 began. Regiments heading for the war passed through Tsarskoye. All people came out to see them off. And Lyceum students, of course, too. They hugged the mustachioed grenadiers, wished them victory, and returning home alive. All the people rose up to fight the invaders. The peasants gathered in partisan detachments and smashed the invaders on the roads, in forests and villages. Alexander passionately dreamed of military exploits and many times imagined himself on a horse racing alongside his friends towards the enemy. He was still too young and did not know that other feats, other glory await him and his friends. That Pushkin, Kuchelbecker, and his other comrades will become Decembrists, revolutionaries, will boldly oppose the autocracy, and for this they will be exiled to Siberia for many, many years. And he himself, a friend of the Decembrists, a singer of freedom and truth, is waiting for exile and deprivation and enmity and painful experiences. Time passed and Alexander's talent grew and matured. The poems of the young Lyceum student began to appear in magazines, were published in a collection of the best Russian poems. A new poet is born, they said in bookstores. More and more friends appeared with the young poet. Among them were the hussars who returned after the victorious end of the war, brave, cheerful, educated people who were close to revolutionary ideas. They talked about military affairs, about the heroism of Russian soldiers, ordinary peasants dressed in military uniforms. They talked about how shameful it is to keep in serf slavery a great people who saved all of Europe from enslavement. Alexander listened attentively and thought. He thought more and more seriously about life, about freedom and justice, about the mighty power of the poetic word. On January 8, 1815, an examination in verbal sciences was held at the Lyceum. Gavrila Romanovich Derzhavin, a great Russian poet, was the guest of honor. Derzhavin was old and ill. He felt unwell and almost slept at the table. When it was announced that the Lyceum student Alexander Pushkin would read poems of his own composition, Memories of Tsarskoselsky, Alexander went to the middle of the hall and began to read. He was very agitated. His voice trembled at first because Derzhavin was listening to him. Alexander read poems about Russian military glory, about the War of 1812, about the Moscow fire, about the heroism of the people. His voice grew stronger, became more and more confident, and at the sound of this young, resonant voice, reciting sonorous and beautiful verses, the old poet raised his head, his eyes shone, he seemed to have rejuvenated. When the reading was over and everyone was silent in admiration, the old man got up from his chair and said loudly,
"That's who will replace Derzhavin."
He stretched out his trembling hands to embrace Pushkin. But Alexander was no longer there. He ran out of the hall. In terrible excitement, he flew up the stairs to the 4th floor and threw himself on the bed in his small room, bursting into happy tears. Pushkin remembered this day for the rest of his life. In some time, he became a frequent guest in the house of the famous writer and historian Nikolai Mikhailovich Karamzin, talked with him about art, listened to the advice of an experienced master, read his poems. Poetic successes and early fame did not make Alexander conceited. On the contrary, he worked harder and harder. In the evenings and nights he sat by a candle, with a pen, and amazing, fabulous images arose in his imagination.
The things of days in lied gone, the legends of the past obscure.
Ruslan and Lyudmila, he decided to name his first big poem, a fairy tale about Russian antiquity, about valor, fidelity, and love. 6 high school years have passed. June 9, 1817, in the presence of Emperor Alexander I, graduation of Lyceum students took place. Each was called by name. Alexander Pushkin resounded loudly under the vaults of the hall. The two Alexanders looked at each other. One bowed respectfully, the other nodded graciously from his chair. The almighty ruler could not even imagine what great power over the minds and souls of people every word of this young man would acquire over time. Beyond the threshold of the Lyceum, a new life began, a life full of sorrows and joys, victories and disappointments, intense creative work, the difficult and glorious fate of the great poet of Russia, the end. Thanks for listening and subscribe to the Storyteller channel. See you next time.